guys. Okay, so we're going to look at World War II, but just to give you a heads up, because we are in our final days, I'm not covering any really like major battles or anything like that. I'm just saying, hey, this was the war. um, so anyway, please make sure that you read in your textbook, because your textbook does give you some more detailed information of the military conflict. So yeah, so do that. All right, so World War II. Most people tend to agree that World War II started in the Pacific when Japan invaded Manchuria. But sort of the traditionally held view is that it starts September of 1939. As we already mentioned, the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact with Germany in 1939, basically stating that, hey, we will leave you alone to go and invade and do the different things that you want to do, Germany. And in return, Germany, give us lands that we lost in World War I. This cartoon down at the bottom is probably one of my favorite political cartoons that I have seen from World War II. I don't know how well you can see it on the video, but when you pull up the PowerPoint, you can look at it more closely. It is a cartoon where Adolf Hitler on the right and Joseph Stalin on the left are in a like a three-legged walk, right? At least that's what it looks like. And they're not quite in a race. They're, you know, arm in arm. Life is good, right? But they each have a pistol behind their backs as well. And down at the bottom it says, someone is taking someone for a walk. So this is just a very interesting cartoon, because it helps to show us that, you know, Hitler and Stalin, they never really trusted each other. Stalin was probably a little bit more trusting than what he should have been, but Hitler never had any intention whatsoever of befriending the Soviets. That was not part of his plan. Hitler attacked Poland September 1st. September 3rd, we have the Allied powers, minus the United States, of course, declaring war on Germany, and World War II begins. Germany was known for its blitzkrieg, or its lightning war. And this is where you have tanks and airplanes and basically your entire your military force striking very, very quickly. May of 1940, we have the Battle of France. And the French, you know, they were scared to death after World War I of having World War I happen all over again, right? Well, what they've done is, you know, after World War I, they lost a generation of men. So they pull out of retirement a World War I general, and he ultimately surrenders to Adolf Hitler because he wants to prevent the same type of casualties, the same type of loss as what was experienced in the Great War. In July of 1940, we have the Battle of Britain, and the Brits are able to hold on until November, and ultimately were able to push the Nazis back. If you've watched that movie, The Chronicles of Narnia, the most recent one by Disney, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, at the very beginning, you'll notice that the children are being sent off on trains. And that actually did happen. They would send the children out of the cities and send them to the countryside to keep them safe. So the Brits did what they could, and they were able to hold their ground. The Soviet Union, once again, they were allied with the Axis powers, and they annexed their land lost in World War I. However, with Operation Barbarossa, Adolf Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union was like, ah! And they probably were expecting it to happen, just not that quickly. So anyway, they no longer held their alliance with the Axis powers, but became an ally. Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941. By December, The Germans were outside of Moscow and Leningrad. But here's the thing, something I tell my CIF students over and over again. The one country you don't invade is Russia. It's a bad idea. It's just a really, really bad idea. Its winters are incredibly harsh, and it just keeps going on forever and ever and ever. And the Soviets are really good at pulling themselves inland, and they will burn things in their wake so that the invading force has nothing to use for support. So it's just a bad idea. So like Napoleon Bonaparte before him, Adolf Hitler eventually is forced to stop because of the Russian winter. But on the way, 6 million Soviets were either killed or captured. So this is not insignificant. Russia may be huge, but or not just Russia, but the Soviet Union may cover a great deal of land. But 6 million losses, that's rather tremendous. Japan, also part of the Axis powers, they started occupying French Indochina, which included Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And they started a campaign of going through the Pacific. If you remember, Japan doesn't really have a lot of natural resources, and so it needed to constantly import. Well, as time progressed and as the U.S. and others cut Japan off, Japan sought resources from places immediately around it in Southeast Asia and in the Pacific. The U.S. implemented a total embargo on all exports to Japan, and this was before the U.S. had entered the war. And then on December 7th, 1941, the anniversary of which was yesterday, right? The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, which was a naval base in Hawaii. It destroyed a huge portion of the naval fleet. FDR then went before Congress requesting a declaration of war, stating that December 7th, 1941 was a date which will live in infamy. This was especially sort of maybe frustrating or don't know what I'm trying to say. Anyway, angering maybe? Angering is a good word. Because there was a Japanese representative who was at the White House shortly before, and basically everybody sort of assured each other of peace. And then we have the attack on Pearl Harbor. So, very angering situation. But although the U.S. wanted to seek revenge on the Japanese, the Europeans convinced the Americans that focusing on Europe first, that putting most of the effort in Europe first, defeating Hitler first, would be the more important step. And then once Europe was secured, they could then turn to the Pacific. So the Americans agreed, and eventually we will see the Americans and other allies storming the beaches of Normandy, France. And in this invasion, we see the use of amphibious assault vehicles known as Higgins boats. And I include this guy just because of the Louisiana relationship here. Andrew Higgins was a boat maker, and he tested these boats in Lake Pontchartrain, a great place to test it. If you've ever been there, it's just incredibly choppy, and it's not often that we have nice, calm waters. These boats were so effective at getting the troops on land, across from Britain to France, and they were just really, really, good pieces to have in the arsenal. Dwight Eisenhower later on would say that Higgins won the war for the Allies. That's how important the Higgins boats were. So again, we just flew through all of this because we are at the end of the semester, and I really just wanted to point out a couple of things. In early 1945, the Allies made it to Germany, but Hitler refused to evacuate the citizens out of Berlin. So he and his wife, along with some top Nazi officials, went into a bunker where they committed suicide. possibly some murder-suicide, depending on what happened. We really don't know what happened in that bunker. There's some conspiracy theorists who say, oh, Hitler didn't really die, but yeah, I'm pretty sure he did. Over in Italy, Benito Mussolini and his mistress were killed. And Germany surrendered on May 8th, 1945. But that still leaves the Pacific open, and good to their word, the Europeans helped the Americans then to turn their attention specifically to the Pacific in the battle or in the war against the Japanese. So, sorry, my camera's going all over the place here. So in the Pacific, especially to start off with, you have mostly the U.S. Navy and Marines. There's very few others who are there. Excuse me, I needed something to drink. So, probably one of, if not the most significant battles of the Pacific is the Battle of Midway. The Battle of Midway was incredibly significant because the Japanese fleet, a huge portion of it, much like, you know, Pearl Harbor with the U.S. fleet, the vast majority of it being sort of all anchored together, at Midway there is a huge Japanese fleet. There's aircraft carriers, there's smaller boats, there's, you know, all these different pieces of their navy, and the Americans are able to destroy this huge fleet, and that really cripples the Japanese Navy. Americans begin an island hopping campaign, as it's known. You go from island to island, clearing it out and securing the different islands. Down at the bottom right, you see a picture of my great uncle Gene Tapia, who was in the Marine Corps, and he fought in, I can't remember if it was every major Pacific battle or nearly every major Pacific battle in which the Marines were heavily involved. He did a great deal of guerrilla warfare, and he had somebody help him write a book about his experiences, and he said there were some things that he has tried to remember, but he just can't because of how horrific some of the details are and some of the memories are. But he could remember waking up from time to time, and he would wake up and from some sort of movement, you know, to his side, and he'd wake up and look over, and there was one of his Marine comrades, and their throats had been slit. So the Japanese were brutal, they were ruthless, and probably probably the worst at inflicting casualties, physical as well as psychological wounds. Just truly horrible. Anyway, February 1945, the U.S. begins to bomb the Japanese islands. August the 6th, we might could say that August the 6th and August the 9th were two dates which would live in infamy, because this is when the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There's a lot of questions over whether or not this was necessary. There is some argument that had the atomic bombs not been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that the will of the Japanese was so strong that they would not have relented, that they would have continued fighting. Others say that Japan was already crippled and would not be able to continue on in their fight, and so, you know, that controversy sort of reigns supreme, because with these acts we have entered into the atomic age, and the period of time of which John Green points this out in a sort of nearly comical way, but the period of time that humanity has had the capability of completely annihilating itself is very, very short when you compare it to the larger history of the world. Just a few days after the second bomb was dropped, Japan surrenders on August 15th, 1945, thus ending World War II. Probably what's most familiar about World War II, the thing that we tend to remember and talk about the most, are the atrocities. And it's like this morbid fascination that we have. But let's go over it, right? I mean, why not? So, we already talked about how Jews were targeted in in the 1930s, in late 1920s and 1930s in Germany, and they were forced to live in particular sections by themselves, sometimes forced to live in ghettos. Um, we see them begin to be targeted um, in terms of their livelihoods. So at a certain point, they're no longer citizens. Licenses are revoked, so practicing physicians and lawyers and people like that, they can no longer work for the state. So yeah, lots of different issues like that going on. And late 1930s, it became nearly impossible for a Jew to be able to leave Germany. In 1942, genocide was formally adopted. Now, this had already been taking place, sort of on a smaller scale, but it is formally adopted in 1942, and it starts with mobile gas vans just going to communities and killing a dozen or so at a time. But this wasn't enough, so they began to build much larger gas chambers, which could kill thousands at a time. And then we have the establishment of the death camps. There is a difference between concentration camps and death camps. Excuse me for all of the wobbliness. Got to get more comfortable here. There are some which are work camps and some which are specifically death camps. And there are 6 death camps in Poland. Some people died in transit, from dehydration or other issues. But whenever people arrived and they were, still living, they would have been divided. Men from women. Children, for the most part, would have kind of stayed with the women. Women, children, old people, and pregnant women were going to be targeted first. I guess it's sort of redundant to have women and pregnant women, but pregnant women in particular posed a huge threat because they were carrying another child like them. So they needed to be done away with so that they could not give birth. Women who were not pregnant, children, and the elderly were seen as burdens. And since they were a burden, they needed to be removed. Those who could would be worked. Auschwitz was the largest camp in which more than 12,000 people were killed each day, and more than 1 million Jews were killed by the war's end. A lot of people have asked about, like, okay, well, how did people not know? Well, the thing is, people did know. But you also have to remember the phrase, ignorance is bliss. So some people simply turned a blind eye. They were scared. They didn't want to be the next group of people on the train. So the government definitely tries to cover up what's going on, especially to the outside world. And eventually, of course, news does leak out. And I think a lot of people didn't quite want to believe it. And a lot of people didn't think that it could be believed. They thought it was, just kind of crazy that this type of genocide was taking place. So it's not until Germany is invaded and Poland is invaded that we get a very real sense of the death toll. Just very, very, very intense. However, we also must realize that that God is gracious, and that people were still grateful for the Almighty God. And there was one Holocaust victim, we have no idea who it was, but they wrote a poem on the wall of one of the camps. And part of it is here. It says, I believe in the sun even when it's not shining. I believe in love even when I don't feel it. I believe in God even when he is silent. So that's really just a testament to God's goodness in the midst of, you know, a horrible tragedy. However, the Germans are not the only ones. The Germans and the Japanese are not the only people who are guilty of harming others. In the United States, there are Japanese internment camps or relocation centers established. Pearl Harbor freaks everybody out. Now, we mostly see this occurring in the West with the establishment of these camps because that's where we have the largest pockets, at least at this time, of Asian communities. The conditions, probably not nearly as bad as what you would find in the death camps or the concentration camps for the Germans, but certainly not wonderful. Housing was primitive, but it was equivalent to most of the military barracks. So, okay, well, if our soldiers can put up with it, all right, right? But you've got whole families trying to live there. They also were guarded by armed guards, and some of them did discharge their weapons at some of the detainees who attempted to leave from time to time. There was also very poor medical care, and people died unnecessarily and got sick unnecessarily just because of a lack of medical care. But before war's end, in 1944, the government ordered an end to the internment camps and released everyone. But those who were in the internment camps got home. Most of them went home to find their houses vandalized, looted. Sometimes they just would pick up what they could and they moved to completely different places. Others, they attempted to rebuild and rebuild their lives, but very difficult to do after that. Again, we don't have, we cannot relegate evil only to a particular group of people because we are all evil. We are born into sin, and all evil is evil. And sometimes we like to rank evil. In fact, I was reading a scripture verse about this the other day. I'm going to read it to you because scripture does quite a bit to help us put everything into perspective. This is Psalm 130. I'm just going to read verses, let's say, 1 through 5. Out of the depths I call to you, Lord. Lord, listen to my voice. Let your ears be attentive to my cry for help. Lord, if you considered sins, Lord, who could stand? But with you there is forgiveness, so that you may be revered. I wait for the Lord. I wait and put my hope in his word. So, if God considered sins, who could stand? So often we tend to rank sins and say, well, I'm not an Adolf Hitler, right? I'm not a Joseph Stalin. I'm not a Mao Zedong or, Ted Bundy or anything. I'm not like that, right? But we must remember that all sin is sin. And without Christ's blood, we have to answer for those sins. Scary thought. As we look at this, the Soviets guilty of mass rapes and looting. The British guilty of looting and bombing civilian areas. They weren't supposed to do that. Most of the Allies were guilty of torturing and killing prisoners of war without cause other than wanting to seek revenge. The Japanese and the Germans were the most horrific. Their actions were the most horrific. But, once again, we are all guilty. We cannot say that that one is better than the other. One of the most provocative questions that I considered when thinking about World War II, most people will say, what got us out of the Depression? Oh, World War II got us out of the Depression. Really? So this is my response to that. It's perverse to think that war improved the economy. Um, the economy is crap now, so does that mean that we need to go to war? Well, guess what? We are still fighting a little bit overseas. Has it done anything to help the economy? No, it hasn't. Um, the war gave 100% employment to men in the military and as military support. It also pushed women into the workforce, but everything was rationed. All food, um, tires and gas and all that, everything was rationed so that because everything was mobilized specifically for the war effort. When the war was over and everyone came home, recession was still in place because the economy did not structurally benefit from the war. The economy improved because everyone else was decimated. And due once again in large part to post traumatic stress, men started taking more than one job, leading to an increase in his family's wealth, leading once again to a boost in the economy because families suddenly had more disposable income. So, just like World War I, in World War II, Americans did not experience the devastating um, um, results of warfare on the land. Other than Pearl Harbor and a place in Alaska, the U.S. suffered very little. Physically speaking, in terms of the land and the infrastructure, it suffered very, very little during the war. However, we did suffer great losses in terms of people, but again, not nearly as much as everyone else, as the Europeans, as the Soviets. Look at, I mean, the Soviets just in the beginning, we in Operation Barbarossa, 6 million people. Um, so we can't say that the Depression ended, or excuse, yeah, the Depression ended because we entered into the war. No, not at all. It is because of individual actions, and individual actions moved us out of the Depression into a time of economic um, growth. So that is where we are going to leave off with that lecture, and I'm going to see about getting the other ones up for you soon. I can't stop the video.